I think we'll get started today. Thank you all for coming on a very beautiful day. It's about as pretty a fall day as they come. But I think you'll really enjoy spending some time here this afternoon with Dr. Larry Guerra. He's finishing up our year of programs that have been focusing on the American Civil War with the 150th anniversary of the commencement of the war. But we're going to look at it today, a little bit different aspect of it than we have before. We had a program, I think I did in the spring, on Yellow Springs in the beginning of the Civil War. Scott Sunders did a great program on Antioch College in the Civil War. Now we're going to look at the peace movement during the Civil War, and Dr. Guerra's got a wealth of experience to bring to that. He's a retired history professor from Wilmington College, concentrating on history and peace studies, and he describes himself as a part-time peace activist, so we'll get that aspect of it as well. He's written 5 books, including one on the legends of the Underground Railroad, but also one he tells me that he's most pleased with, called A Few Small Candles, and it's war resistors of World War II tell their stories. So I think from that aspect we'll get a great presentation today, and so with no further ado, Dr. Guerra, if you want to take the mic, you're welcome to it.
Thanks a lot. Back in Yellow Springs, when I was in prison in World War II, I was in there with several Antioch students, then Antioch students, Bronson Clark and Bill Richards and Meredith Dallas, and there were quite a few. And then later, I actually moonlighted one semester at Antioch. Enjoyed that. So Yellow Springs means a lot to me. I saw my first pileated woodpecker up here, too. The Civil War has deep roots in the American psyche. I'm not here. Yeah, thank you. It's about like me here.
You get a lawyer and a peace activist trying to put
Okay, that's fine.
Does that work?
Yeah. The war lives on with its battle reenactments, museum exhibits, tourist visits to battlefields, and tons of books and films. Despite the war's popularity today, the Civil War generation itself was divided in its support of the conflict. Some Christian denominations took the Sermon on the Mount seriously and required their members to avoid military service. Those were not just the historic peace churches, the Quakers, the Mennonites, and the Church of the Brethren, but they included a number of smaller sects, some of whom had emigrated to the New World to avoid European militarism. Pacifism was also a basic tenet for members of several utopian socialist communities. Religion, in short, was a major factor in early American pacifism. Another important factor was the impact of the Enlightenment, which fostered the age of reform in the new nation. Many of America's first policymakers embraced the idea that by using reason as a guide, not a bad idea, huh? Human problems and injustices could be overcome. The most powerful argument for substituting reason for religious faith was made by Tom Paine in his book, The Age of Reason, the same Tom Paine who wrote Common Sense in support of American independence. The horrifying impact of the Napoleonic Wars sparked the beginning of a peace movement, both in Europe and the United States. In 1828, a number of local peace societies in New England joined forces to create the American Peace Society. From its beginning, the American Peace Society was an anti-war rather than a strictly pacifist organization. members were required to oppose only offensive wars, and anyone who agreed with that, even members of the military, could join. Peace was low on the scale of popular reform, but it was always included. Although by nature a minority organization, the Peace Society counted many of the nation's leading thinkers as members. Moreover, its ranks included a group of dedicated absolute pacifists, who were then referred to as ultraists or non-resistants. They worked diligently to remold the Peace Society to their ideology. Their influence created a lot of dissension and eventually a new organization, the New England Non-Resistance Society, which was headed by William Lloyd Garrison, its founder. Founded in 1838, it was the first absolute pacifist organization in the country. Members not only pledged never to participate in any or support any war, but to withhold their support from all governments, which were always based on violence. Not surprisingly, the new Peace Society was even smaller than its parent, the American Peace Society, which, despite its less radical program, made an important mark in American history. Society publications included a wealth of information about the financial and moral cost of war, held essay contests on the topic of Congress of Nations for the prevention of war, and made world peace an issue for serious consideration. Many in the anti-slavery and other 19th century reform movements added the cause of peace to their list of urgent issues. Those reformers included Ralph Waldo Emerson, Charles Sumner, Henry David Thoreau, and Horace Mann. They were all abolitionists, and eventually those who lived long enough had to decide whether or not to support the Civil War. Horace Mann is a good example of a non-pacifist who supported the peace cause. Education and anti-slavery were Mann's major reform interests, but he also thought of world peace as a logical result of mining the resource of reason. Mann suggested that educators should develop in their students a sense of philanthropy and brotherhood, and should substitute peace heroes for war heroes in their classes. He did not approve military statues in public places, and once advised his wife not to take their children to see a battlefield because he believed children should not be taught about the wrongs and wickedness of men. Mann was in Congress several times, and while there, he had a unique opportunity to support world peace. As a member of the Board of Visitors to West Point, he wrote his wife of his intention to make war on war. He did that by warning the cadets to prepare themselves for the day when war would become obsolete. More than a century before the Manhattan Project, Mann predicted that someone would invent a weapon so terrible it could destroy 2 warring armies within an hour, and thus make war a thing of the past. Horace Mann did not live to see the day when the Civil War would shatter those hopes and force him to make hard decisions. Although Mann missed that moral dilemma, Elihu Burritt and his fellow absolute pacifists did not. Burritt, a self-educated blacksmith who taught himself 7 languages, developed original ideas about peace. He had a special gift for organizing, and he endeavored to present his ideas to the working class, even proposing a general strike against war. He wrote and circulated peace tracts called olive branches, and believed that universal peace would also bring an end to slavery. For several years he lived in England, where he organized the League of Universal Brotherhood, that required a strict pledge not to participate in or support any war. In the early pre-war years, the peace movement had influenced public opinion. Southern threats and armed battles in Kansas convinced many Americans in the North that civil war was a real possibility. Yet many signs suggested such a war would not be popular. To avoid civil war, William Lloyd Garrison suggested that the slave states be permitted to secede from the Union. And when South Carolina led the secession movement, abolitionist editor Horace Greeley also suggested the slave states be allowed to depart in peace. After all attempts to negotiate a settlement had failed, public opinion in the North shifted when Fort Sumter was fired upon. When that happened, there were also divisions among the Northern peace people. Their positions also hardened. On the political front, the Democratic Party for years had catered to the Southern demands. With the onset of armed conflict, a faction of the Democrats became an anti-war party. Calling themselves Peace Democrats, they posed a threat to Lincoln's war as well as a problem for those who opposed the war on the basis of conscience. Clement Vallandigham of Ohio assumed leadership of the Peace Democrats, constantly challenging the president's crackdown on civil liberties and refusal to negotiate an end to the war. General Burnside, who commanded the federal troops in Ohio, forbade Vallandigham to enter the state. Vallandigham's defiant response was to enter Ohio and deliver a scathing attack on Lincoln. Burnside had him arrested and tried for treason by a military commission. To avoid making Vallandigham a martyr, Lincoln ordered him sent to the Confederacy. From there, he escaped to Canada, where he ran for governor of Ohio and got enough support to provide a serious scare to the Lincoln administration. Peace Democrats also posed a problem for those who opposed the war on grounds of conscience. In the North, young men who refused to fight were scorned as being anti-union, even pro-slavery. The issue that forced young men in both Union and the Confederacy to reconcile their actions with their conscience was conscription. Many working class people believed the draft was weighted against them because a man could avoid serving by providing a substitute or paying $300 in the North, $500 in the Confederacy. And when the measure took effect, violent acts against draft officers as well as general rioting broke out in several northern states. Riots in New York City were the most serious. Abolitionists and African Americans became targets for the mostly Irish working class mobs that rummaged through the city for 3 days before federal troops restored order. While the riots were anti-war and anti-draft, it was resentment, racism, and some pro-Southern sentiment that inspired them. They were an embarrassment for Elihu Burritt, Adam Ballou, Alfred Love, Lucretia Mott, and all the others who stuck to their pacifism during a time of war. Elihu Burritt never wavered in his pacifism, the cause he had so skillfully promoted both in Europe and the United States. While he was loyal to the Union, he thought it sophistry to argue that the Union Army was merely a police force dealing with a kind of riot. Convinced that slavery could be abolished without war, Burritt was disillusioned when so many of his former allies were swept up in the war spirit. Continuing to speak out even when few would listen, he wrote a friend, This is truly a trial hour. All the ministers of the gospel, the religious press, all classes of the community have been swept into the current. I have been distressed at my inability to put forth a feather's weight against the war spirit. I feel that I have gone as far as I could without exposing myself to arrest in exposing the war. I feel powerless and almost alone. While Durring and others agonized over the war spirit, it was younger male members of the peace churches who were forced to resolve the conflict between the demands of the nation state and their faith-based pacifism. For the first time, young American males, North and South, faced conscription. The very idea of a national military draft seemed to be an un-American concept and spawned protests in both the North and the South. Riots in the North were matched by strong resistance in parts of the South. Several Confederate governors openly challenged it. In some parts of the South that were earlier anti-secession, the law could not be enforced. Many Southerners resented the draft with its exemption for $500 and for slave owners. One Mississippi senator said, "Never did a law meet with so much odium than the exemption of slave owners." Members of the peace churches had different concerns, though most of them had downplayed their testimony against war. Each of them had some young men who took the testimony seriously. During most of the conflict, conscientious objectors in the Union could legally avoid military service only by paying a commutation fee or supplying a substitute. But there were other paths out, in part because the draft was so poorly administered, and in part because of personal intervention by officials. President Lincoln and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and other federal officials understood and sympathized with those who, for religious reasons, refused to kill. A flood of representatives traveled to Washington to plead the objectors' cause, often requesting and receiving interviews with Stanton or Lincoln. When Elder Frederick Evans of the Shaker community met with Lincoln, the president was impressed with Shaker's sincerity and their support of the Union. It's reported that he added, "We need regiments of such men as you." Then he issued a blanket exemption, furloughing the Shaker draftees for an indefinite period. The exemption was later extended to the Pleasant Hill, Kentucky Shakers, who were briefly under Confederate rule. Even though the 70 young Shakers of draft age were relieved of war duty, the Kentucky Shakers suffered deprivation and loss of property as a result of their presence in a combat area. They fed at least 50,000 soldiers of both armies and suffered the loss of supplies, livestock, and buildings. A total loss estimated at $100,000. That's a lot of bucks back there. Despite all that, they held on to their pacifism. The perfectionists of Oneida community that supported the Northern cause and avoided conflict with the draft through bureaucratic inefficiency. The first draft was administered by the states. The Oneida community, situated on the border between two New York counties, and they escaped pressure because officials in each county thought the community was in the other. That's right. None of the young men of the community was called up under later federal draft. While the communitarians were selected pacifists and anti-government in principle, they could not openly resist a war against slavery, but they did oppose military service for all community members. They also believed in helping their neighbors to the extent of paying the commutation fee for several young men who lived near the community. Aidan Ballew's Hopedale community in Massachusetts was also dedicated to non-resistance. Ballou had written Christian Non-Resistance. It was a classic of religious pacifism. And Hopedale was short-lived, and by the time of the Civil War, had only 50 members. During the war, the community published 2 pamphlets. One asserted their opposition to the Confederacy and their continued faith in Christian nonviolence. The other, written by Ballou, was an answer to Henry Ward Beecher's bitter attack on pacifism. Ballou wrote, "Mr. Beecher gives us the ethics of a plucky pugilist. If this be Christianity, we might as well have no Christianity." Only one member of Hopedale broke with Ballou and joined the Union Army. One other was drafted, forcing a difficult community decision. Some favored paying commutation fee, while others wanted total resistance. Ballou and the community reluctantly paid the fee, though the draftee himself did not approve. It was a decision that Ballou later regretted. The German inspirationists of the Amana community in Iowa were also pacifists, torn between military service or hoping for an alternative. Their support for the Union cause led them to provide food, clothing, and blankets to the Army and to contribute to the bounty fund for recruitment. In 1863, the community willingly paid a total of $4,800 in commutation fees to free 16 of their members from military service. And that was the usual course of action for some of these groups. Most Mennonites and Amish young men were willing to pay the commutation fee as well. Some congregations raised a special fund to help those who could not themselves provide the fee. A smaller number hired substitutes. Some joined the military where they were assigned hospital duty. Some were forcibly inducted, and some simply took to the woods. Those who had not attained full membership in their church suffered the harshest treatment. You know, they were Anabaptists, so they weren't really full members until they were adults. So the young men who were subject to the draft had a hard time. Several organized units refused to fire their weapons in combat, a problem that plagued the military down to World War II. It's one of those invisible parts of the war. Absolute pacifists who refused all cooperation with the military were the ones who suffered most from their convictions. Although they had no sympathy for the rebellion, a point their leaders always emphasized, they were often drafted involuntarily, forcing them to deal with scornful, non-commissioned officers. While Army privates were routinely sympathetic, Quaker Cyrus Pringle meant only contempt when he tried to explain to a junior officer his refusal to carry a rifle. In his diary, Pringle described the junior officers as possessing liberally the characteristics of these: pride, vanity, conceit, an arbitrary spirit, impatience, profanity, and contempt for all things holy. That does it. That's what the junior officers were like. Many generals, on the other hand, realized trying to convince sincere pacifists to be soldiers was a waste of energy. Union military officials also appreciated the many peace memorials and other public statements strongly separating their witness against war from those groups and individuals who sided with the South. When a major in the United States Army was handed a Quaker anti-war leaflet, he commented, "That tract is true, and the doctrine right, but we must wait to put it in practice until after the war closes." Even in the Confederacy, there were some military authorities who were lenient towards non-resistance. After observing a Mennonite who refused to fire his weapon during combat, General Thomas Stonewall Jackson said, "There lives a people in the Valley of Virginia that are not hard to bring to the army. While there, they are obedient to their officers. Nor is it difficult to have them take aim, but it is impossible to get them to take correct aim. I therefore think it better to leave them at their homes that they may produce supplies for the army." That's pretty good, huh? Despite Jackson's attitude, war objectors in the Confederate States faced a more severe ordeal than those in the Union. Many were anti-slavery and anti-secessionists, and unlike their northern counterparts, they could not support their country's cause. Drafted objectors frequently deserted, hoping to reach Union forces or to get into a northern state. The large number of border state newspaper ads from families trying to locate relatives known to be deserters provides evidence of mass desertion from the Confederate Army. The Union Army also was troubled with desertion, especially after a major battle. The culture of the South encouraged a military tradition, and most elected officials had little or no sympathy with pacifists. A notable exception was Judge John A. Campbell, Assistant Secretary of War. Like Stanton in the North, Campbell frequently intervened to rescue men drafted against their conscience. He had unusual authority and used it fairly and wisely. Campbell also received appeals from the few peace churches in the South. Despite Campbell's intervention, objectors in the Confederacy, as well as some of those in the Union, sometimes faced torture and even death. While the actual number will ever be known, it is clear that most of those in the South who held to the pacifist belief paid a heavy price. An example was Seth Laughlin, who was forced to go without sleep for 48 hours while a soldier armed with a bayonet stood guard to stab him should he fall asleep. When that did not break him, he was tied down for 3 hours, then suspended by his thumbs for an hour and a half. After a week of such torture, Laughlin was court-martialed and ordered to be shot. With other soldiers as witnesses, Laughlin faced 12 men holding 6 loaded and 6 empty rifles. Remaining calm, he requested time for a prayer in which he asked God to forgive his tormentors. At that, the men on the firing squad dropped their rifles, saying they could not kill such a man. Even the officers were impressed, and they revoked the sentence and sent Laughlin to a prison, where he suffered weeks of further mistreatment before dying from his ordeal. Young men who refused Confederate military service were not the only ones in the South to suffer because of their views. Like the Shakers of Pleasant Hill, the Quakers of Loudoun County, Virginia, found themselves situated in a contested combat area. When the issue in Virginia was still undecided, they had been anti-slavery and anti-secession. Many had already left the state because of slavery. When the war came and Virginia seceded, most Loudoun County Quakers, though loyal to the Union, claimed neutrality. 16 men violated the peace testimony and joined the Union Army. Some, disowned earlier for holding slaves, had already sided with the Confederacy, and a few even joined the Confederate Army. During the war, a unit of Confederate Rangers kept close watch on the Loudoun County Quakers, entering their farms and towns from time to time. They foraged on Quaker farms, stole livestock, and demanded to be housed and fed. They also bullied and threatened the Quakers, some of whom were jailed and tortured. Later, Union troops chased the Confederates away and then behaved in exactly the same manner. Because Virginia had seceded, Union officers assumed Loudoun County citizens were all pro-Confederate. Indeed, it was the Union troops that laid waste to parts of the county, setting barns on fire, flour mills also, and crops. Many of the Quaker men went into exile in Maryland, emigrating later to the Midwest. Most Virginia Quakers who joined the Union Army were not disowned, and when the war was over, they got good standing if they repented. For all of Loudoun County Quakers, the war was a terrible experience that united them through the ordeal and reduced the number of meetings in the post-war years. In other words, the meetings combined, and they got together much better after the war. The Quakers, with 200,000 members, were by far the largest of the peace sects, providing a good number of the Civil War absolute pacifists. Political authorities in the North were well aware of their historic peace testimony. The war did not stop them from preaching peace in their periodicals and public gatherings, though they always made clear their loyalty to the Union. At times, the authorities were amazingly tolerant. An Ohio Quaker, Anne Branson, visited 2 recruiting officers to tell them about the Quaker testimony against all war, saying it was wrong to persecute those whose conscience forbade them to kill. She said, "I use great plainness of speech in regard to the inconsistency of war with the gospel dispensation." The officers listened politely, refusing to arrest her under a new law that provided imprisonment for anyone who discouraged men to enlist. Other Quakers and their followers continued to write and circulate anti-war pamphlets, even after the war began. John Foster, a Rhode Island Quaker, wrote and published War and Christianity, Irreconcilable. This was in response to a newspaper refusal to print a letter from him. It was mostly a list of quotes from other pacifist writers. Alfred Love, a close fellow traveler of the Quakers, also wrote a defense of pacifism as an answer to a man who had abandoned his pacifist principles in support of the war. In his appeal in vindication of peace principles, Love wrote, "Think of it, each side appealing to the same Father for directly opposite ends. There's but one God. He is not a God of battle." While these and other Quaker publications were intended primarily for Friends, they also circulated in the society at large. The war sometimes divided the Quakers, and that division was echoed in the ranks of the young men of draft age. More of that group joined the military than Friends cared to admit, and some meetings did not even keep records. The same was true for disownment. While some meetings overlooked the issue and did not record the decisions of young men, others did disown any who served in the military. Men disowned for violating the peace testimony were often reinstated if they admitted error, which some refused to do. Some either paid the commutation fee or allowed others to pay it for them. Fewer hired substitutes. Absolute non-resistors who refused all cooperation with the military were the ones who paid most deeply for their convictions, because there was no legal provision for that position. When Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, he really tried to do right, but issued an order permitting peace sect members to choose non-combatant service in hospitals or work with the freedmen refugees, he hoped it would solve the problem of the ultra non-resistor draftees. And he became angry to learn that the Quakers would not officially endorse that course for their members. Undoubtedly, Some members did accept such service, but not the absolutists who remained the victim of brutal treatment. Their only hope continued to be individual relief from administration officials. Getting such help required time and effort, and sometimes also involved conditions which the draftee could not accept. Henry D. Swift, a Massachusetts Quaker, was placed in the guardhouse when he refused to obey an order to participate in a military drill. He was sent to a camp near Boston Harbor, from which troops were sent to combat areas in the South. While in the camp, he voluntarily helped in hospital service, but he wouldn't accept pay, nor would he obey orders. He was tied down and told he would be shot if he continued to disobey. He was taken from the guardhouse to witness an execution and told that would be his fate unless he changed. When he continued his refusal, he was court-martialed and sentenced to death. But before that sentence could be carried out, several friends took his case to Washington, where Lincoln gave him an honorable parole, which for all purposes became permanent. The case of Cyrus Pringle is better known because his Civil War diary has had several printings. Pringle, a Vermont Quaker, was a living symbol of the Quaker peace testimony. From the moment of his involuntary induction, he refused to obey military orders, beginning with his refusal to accept a weapon. Officers bullied and threatened him, tied him down on the ground, even tried to reason with him, but without success. Pringle was sent south, forced to march all day with a rifle painfully strapped to his shoulder. Quakers from his home meeting supported him, but others urged him to accept a less extreme position. He was ill much of the time and distressed that some friends did not support him. And in his diary he wrote, "Oh, the cruelest blow of all comes from our friends." Their constant plea that he accept hospital work added to his mental anguish. After his unit arrived in Virginia combat area, petty officers continued threats of a firing squad, tied him down for several hours, then placed him on the ground, tying his arms and legs in the form of a cross for several hours in the scorching sun. When Lincoln learned of this treatment, he had Pringle sent to Washington, but could promise relief only if the Quaker would spend a short time working in a non-military capacity in a hospital. Apparently, complaints about releasing Quakers from their military obligation had prompted Stanton and Lincoln to postpone parole for Pringle and others in his predicament. Pringle, weak and traumatized, accepted the offer, only to have it turn sour when he realized that he had merely freed another hospital worker for military service. Determined to quit the job, he was finally paroled and sent home. Cyrus Pringle later became a well-known pioneer plant breeder and a botanical collector credited with discovering more than 1,000 species. Cyrus Pringle's diary, Civil War diary, continues to inspire 21st century pacifists. His story, others from Civil War non-resistors, provides an important chapter in the nearly invisible history of nonviolence in the United States. Despite their opposition to slavery, their recognition of the relationship of means to ends led them to refuse to kill their fellow countrymen. Some of them left records, many did not, but their message that war is not the answer resonates with even greater force today. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
It doesn't sound like there was much interaction between the two true pacifists and the peace Democrats that you mentioned at the beginning, who were opposed to the war but not necessarily to war.
No, because the riots that were getting so much attention targeted abolitionist homes. And some, you know, I mean, no way, they wouldn't accept that. I hate to say it, they were Irish, it was an Irish mob, but that's what it was. I guess that was in a movie, I didn't see that movie. Yes?
I get the impression that there, in the South, there were fewer sort of political peace movements than there were in the North. It sounds like it was almost entirely religious based in the South. Is that true?
That's right. There was fewer of everything. I mean, there were fewer peace churches, and there were fewer COs, and they had tougher ordeal, although some of the Northerners had tough ordeals too.
Yeah.
Yes.
The abolitionists who were also anti-war, what were their expectations if the South successfully succeeded? How would slavery be extinguished? I mean, what were they thinking? How was that going to happen?
Well, Elihu Burr didn't think that the South was going to win. I mean, he was not that naive. He believed that war was the main issue and that other reforms would follow peace. I mean, it may have been a naive thing, but he was an unusual guy. One person, he organized all these activities, including these olive branches. When war between England and the United States seemed to be imminent, he sent his olive branches from people in our cities to people in the English cities, people to people. And he was the first one to talk about a general strike against war. I mean, that's not a good idea, you know? But he was amazing.
A follow-on question. In 1864, the Democratic candidate for the presidency against Lincoln was George McClellan, who of course had been the two-star Army commander of the Army of the Potomac. This must have put Democrats in a very unusual position of having to support presumably an anti-war military man. And I've heard very little of this in history about that. Do you know anything about what were the dynamics of the Democratic Party, how they supported this guy, what happened? Because it seems like a really odd. I mean, it'd be like Westmoreland coming back from Vietnam and running against, Nixon in '68. I mean, it's just a really bizarre thing. I'm just curious how that became.
Well, I think the Democrats were split. They were split. They weren't all peace. See, this is a peace Democrat. This is a faction of the Democrats.
Right.
And I don't know exactly how many there were. In Ohio at that time, there were a lot. Blaine had quite a following around here. But they were split. No question about that. And of course, I often wondered, our General Denver, what was his, he was a Democrat. What was his relationship with McClellan? He resigned.
Right.
Was he in that campaign? They never talk about that. That's one of several. General Denver.
Denver?
James Denver, yeah. Quite a character. He was in Congress for a while, and he was a sort of a, I don't know how to explain it, a perpetual office seeker. Yeah.
Was there a prison option for the pacifists who didn't want to fight? And
No.
okay.
But, except in military prison, yeah. But
And was Libby prison a military prison?
no, Libby was a prisoner of war.
Okay. Prison of war, okay.
Some of them earlier might have been in jail for being abolitionists. When I was in World War II in the prison thing, first place I went was a jail in Philadelphia that had held abolitionists in the 1850s. Monumental prison. It was the jail from hell. Hi. Of course, the other thing I didn't mention is that a lot of these things were very sloppy. The administration of the draft was very sloppy. For instance, people who paid the fee, often that fee was never paid. Sometimes it never got to where it was supposed to be. I mean, there was a lot of, the Oneida situation was just the extreme error that they made. There were a lot of goof-ups in the administrative grant. It wasn't a very efficient thing at all. Of course, nothing was.
Did you?
I was, when did, in what war or what later period did the idea of conscientious objector become more formalized and part of the draft process?
I think World War I. Now, see, the word conscientious objector was not used during the Civil War. They call them non-resistance, from the Bible, non-resistance, resist not evil. And the Mennonites, that's the basis of their peace festival. Later, of course, they did accept active nonviolence, but a lot of them still feel that that's a little too close to violence. I mean, you should not resist. So that's why Garrison used that term, the non-resistance. Yes.
Was your subject today, was this really a minor aspect of the Civil War? Or why is it that I was trying to pay attention in school, as Garrison would say, to the things I could learn, knew nothing about any kind of, I grew up where it was still the war between the states. But nothing was ever mentioned about this, nor did I know anything about the resistance in World War I either. But if you were writing your history book, would you be putting part of this in any American history book now?
I think so. I agree with Horace Mann. You should have heroes of peace as well as heroes of war. And of course, we inculcate the whole military idea, and we are becoming a military state. It's really scary.
Yep.
Eisenhower warned us. He said, beware, the military-industrial complex. And now we've got it in spades. I mean, what's the biggest employer in Ohio? Right out. In Ohio. Yeah, okay. And if they suddenly declared all those jobs out, of course there are other job opportunities. I mean, you have to retrain people and all that. That's been done, another thing. But it's a real problem now. I was amused that they are announcing that there are 300 some jobs coming the right path, but they don't say that there are 2,000 jobs leaving. I mean, it's not good.
We piggyback what Mary was saying. Again, I grew up in the North, and I probably had Union sympathized history books, And you get 2 or 3 paragraphs, and Abraham Lincoln's great, it was a noble cause, and all this stuff. And again, but I learned a lot from my grandmother. My grandmother knew that it was her grandfathers that were in the Civil War, so I knew the people who knew the people. And that was a big thing in our family, how the Civil War affected our family in Tennessee. And the same, the idea was, like Kentucky, it was changing sides all the time.
Yeah.
And they were losing food.
Right.
And my family had to hide food up in the cave because otherwise they'd starve. But this has been an excellent presentation. I've learned a lot. Again, we didn't know. We didn't know this was happening.
Well, that's right.
Yeah, but I wanted to find out what you felt. You go in every classroom, every school, grade school, and everything. There's a picture of Abraham Lincoln. And they're still saying this is a great guy. But my biggest disappointment about Abraham Lincoln was he didn't take it to the table. He seemed like he was a warmonger from one beginning. And I didn't know what your feelings on Abraham Lincoln.
Well, of course, as a historian and as presidents go, he ranks pretty high.
Yeah.
I mean, he was an effective political leader, no question about that. Of course, I didn't agree. He was a colonizationist for blacks. He did not think you should have an interracial society here. And when a group of African Americans met with him, he said, not one of your races equal one of ours. But on the other hand, he did free them. And he did grow. He did grow and change his, at least that part of it. But it's difficult. You know, you talk about evaluating the presidents. I mean, how can you do that, really? I wrote this book about the presidency of Pierce, and it was a real failure in many ways, although in diplomacy he wasn't such a failure. He didn't, but again, things I don't like. I mean, he helped build an empire. He thought he was sure we would acquire Canada. I mean, before that period, they were sure that Canada would gradually, well, they would come to us willingly. But we did acquire things under open Japan. Yes.
Just one more thing we don't know probably is that there is an Occupy Dayton group. They've been there for 30 days. My impression from the news that I heard was that it was only a one-day event. The Dayton Daily News has not given it 1 inch of news. There are some flyers here about what they're doing every Saturday at 1:30 at the Dayton Courthouse. They really could use support. They like food. They like, you know, money, whatever support we can give them. I think we should. And there are flyers here.
Very good. Very good. They're at least bringing the issue up.
And we've been involved locally, you know, on Saturdays.
Yeah.
But, and I appreciate your comments about the current situation, which is scary. And a few months ago, the FBI raided the peace organization in Minneapolis.
Sure.
Raided the homes. And arrested people, or put them in detention. One of the things about that I'm learning about history is, and the idea that you present in comments, or your presentation about how the peace activists were treated. I mean, you know, the United States had concentration camps, treated people, and these people were peaceful people, you know.
Japanese Americans are referring to.
Hmm?
The Japanese Americans.
Well, I'm talking about in the Civil War, how we,
Oh, yeah,
how
yeah.
you were describing how they put these people
Yeah.
over here
Yeah.
and tortured.
Oh, yeah.
Put them in detention.
But there's always somebody who disagrees or tries to mitigate those things. I mean, even at My Lai during Vietnam, there was that one helicopter pilot who noticed what was happening and said, we've got to go down and save those we can, and went down and saved them. There's always somebody. I mean, there were a few people in various diplomatic posts during World War II who were able to give some refuge or way out for some of the Jews. And there's always that. That's the hope. The problem is you don't hear about it. That's what they say. You don't hear about it. In Texas today, they're revising the textbooks and they're removing all the liberals, including Cesar Chavez. Texas has all these Hispanic people and they're taking their hero out and putting Ronald Reagan in and all the conservatives. In the textbooks, that's what the kids are going to get if the teacher doesn't balance it. So, you know, it's public schools. Horace Mann thought the public schools should be not a patriotic thing, but a nationalizing, you know, make us a real nation and give a sense of nationhood to the kids. So that was part of the plan, but not this bad, I hope. But I thought it was interesting that Horace Mann had done that. I found that in his papers, the speech he gave. And it's quite interesting that you never hear that about Horace Mann either.
Your experience, do you think yourself as being a political prisoner?
I do and I don't. I was a political prisoner in the sense of Amnesty International, but I didn't like to separate myself from the other prisoners. Because they're, by the grace of God, go on, you know.
I see.
But yes, I mean, anybody put in prison for ideas or philosophy rather than acts. And my act was that I simply wouldn't sign my name. The first time. The second time, it was that I had counseled a fellow not to sign his name, and I didn't even know him when he did it. And I took the case to the Supreme Court, and we lost 4-4.
You speak up, Bruce.
Yes.
Can you tell me if there's, was there much information exchange among pacifists, among Quaker meetings? Did they know what the other hand was doing, or what pacifistic activities were going on?
You mean the Quakers?
Yeah,
When?
during the Civil War.
Yeah, oh yeah, they did. They kept close tabs, and as I said before, they had their anti-war pamphlets. The interesting thing is that all these peace churches, practically all of them, had sort of been neglected. I mean, there had been a war, and and talking about peace during peacetime just didn't seem to make. So the peace testimony was sort of put on the shelf. It was there, but then when the war hit, and this conscription thing, which nobody even dreamed would happen, then they had to revive it, and so they did, and some of the young members, of course, did that, although many joined the military. Yes.
I was fascinated by your comment that Horace Mann had been a member of the Board of Visitors at West Point.
Yes.
Any more factoids you could tell us? Like, did they get rid of him, and how did he end up on the Board of Visitors in the first place? That strikes me as really
That was
interesting.
probably routine. I mean, he was in Congress, this was his second term, I think.
Uh-huh.
And he was a free soiler then, and anti-slavery. Probably some friend, maybe somebody like Sumner, so I don't know how he got on, but he was a member of the board. I suppose they had to say, who wants to go and give a speech at West Point? I never got the, but I did, in my book, on A Few Small Candles, I titled my chapter, My War on War. And I didn't realize I was plagiarizing Horace Mann. It was in the back of my head.
I'm sure it is.
Somewhere in my, way up there, this war on war thing. No, I wouldn't use that because I don't like everything's war. War on drugs, war on this, war on that. No, I don't like that. I wouldn't use that again, but I did that. So he gave me a title. Yes.
You mentioned a great number of deserters during the Civil War on both sides. What was the punishment for desertion?
Well, they were treated pretty badly, but they didn't catch most of them. I mean, there was no great mass roundup.
You could be shot.
You could be shot, yeah. I didn't run into any. Of course, I wasn't looking for that particular thing, but I didn't run into any of them that were shot. Incidentally, Laughlin, who died, had a wife and children. So that he was treated so bad. And Cyrus Pringle's one of my heroes, but the real one is Elliot Gilbert. I think he's just amazing. And he couldn't add a feather's weight to the cause. I mean, I thought that was a beautiful way of putting it. For a guy who was a blacksmith, he never went to college, he taught himself 7 languages, and he taught language. Oh, he also was in favor of the penny postcard. He said you have to communicate with these other countries, so have penny postcards and write to these people in Europe and prevent wars. People to people. Yes.
I had a sister who did quite a bit of research on letters written to soldiers, both North and South, since this was an area in which families split, some went North and South. And she found letters written by the wives or the mothers of the soldiers that in this geographical territory where it was so badly split, that their fear was not so much of the Army of the North or the Army of the South. It was the deserters that they called marauders, who had no discipline, who had no loyalty, and they had to hide. One letter was this woman had hidden the cow with a new calf and had built kind of a forest enclosure of shrubs because she knew that if they took the cow and the calf, the family really would starve. And she had hoped that her husband was in the Southern Army, that she hoped the Northern troops were going to be there to protect them from the marauders. Although the Northern Army had taken their corn and a number of other things, but probably would not take the cow and the calf.
I wouldn't put it past them.
So they were three sources of danger there, the
Oh, yeah.
North Army, the South Army, and the Marauders.
Yeah. Well, the Shakers always helped anyone who needed it, and if the Confederates needed it, they helped them. If the Union needed it, they helped them, but they didn't join any of the military. They were real pacifists. But they didn't think everybody should be a pacifist. They were. That was their thing. Yes.
Are there any differences between Hicksite and Orthodox Friends in terms of amount of activity, pacifistic activity?
I think there was more activity in Loudoun County with the Hicksites, as I recall. And they were very bitterly divided. But this whole thing brought them together. So they now, after the war, as I said before, had fewer meetings. They were one. It's an interesting byproduct. But they were divided. And I don't know which group provided the people who stuck to slavery, you know. A lot of them had slaves. And were disowned, all of them. One county, and apparently a number of Loudoun County people came up to this area around Wilmington. Well,
Thank you very much.
Yeah.